Chapter 12, Part 2A. So I separated Part 2, Infancy and Childhood, into two sections, Part A and Part B, mostly because the sections are quite long. So to divide it into two 15 to 20 minute videos. Okay, so in this video we will be looking at Part A, the amazing newborn, sensory perceptual development, and physical brain and motor development. William James had originally suggested basically that infants are born with an empty mind, right? Buzzing, booming confusion, they're passive, disorganized, and have an empty mind, and basically that everything starts from birth. We now know that prenatal sensory development, so tactile, auditory, and chemical perceptual systems, they're already stimulated and working at birth. So we no longer have this idea of it being an empty mind. And we're going to look at some of those processes now. So vision. What can newborns see and how do we know? Because newborns can't tell us anything, we have to set up studies where you can sort of infer by their behavior or how they react to things, the processes that are going on. We do know that infants are nearsighted. Their visual acuity is 2,800 at birth, which is 40 times worse than a normal adult. They can focus on objects 20 to 40 centimeters away, which conveniently for their mother's face for breastfeeding. And we know that color vision rapidly develops. Newborn can see three colors, and by 3 months the cones are functional and can perceive a full range of colors. So one of the foundational studies looking at infant visual preferences is the preferential looking procedure by France, 1961. It is quite old, but it's still a foundational piece. So what he did was he would place an infant on their back and he would show them two or three stimuli, and record how long they looked at each of the stimulus, which infers that they find the one that they stare at the longest to be more interesting and they're more attracted to that, right? And what they found is that newborns prefer complex patterns. They prefer the human face versus solid colors. You can see there on figure 12.6. A solid white had the least amount of fixation time. Yellow and red, slightly more interesting. Start to put some more complicated pictures there with the circles. They stared at that a little bit longer. And then you can see at the top when it comes to, there was a circle that had a human face on it, and the newborns stared at that the longest. Okay, so they do this test. It's the preferential looking procedure. And they would do this, say, test their vision at 1 month, at 3 months, at 12 months across time, and see how things develop. Other studies using similar procedures have found that newborns will readily turn towards a noise. They respond to tactile, so when you touch their cheek, they'll turn their head and respond to that, and then also to odors. So what does this mean? Conclusion is that newborns orient to significant stimuli in their environment, the most important being their mother's face, voice, and smell, optimizing their access to food, warmth, and social stimulation. Okay, this is just the figure 12.5 in the text, which is looking at, say, a woman or mother's face through an infant's eyes. So the three images approximate the visual acuity of an infant at 1 month, and at 3 months, and then by 12 months they can see quite clearly. And here's the chart we just talked about. So at birth, they have limited acuity, about 20 to 800. They prefer the pattern stimuli as opposed to the colors. You can see the increased percentage of total fixation time here. Habituation procedure, that is when the looking time declines by 50%. Looking time declines by 50%. So with increased exposure to it, the infant habituates to the stimuli and will actually look at new stimulus when it's presented. This habituation procedure is not in the text here, and it won't be on the test, so don't worry about that. Okay, next section. Newborn learning. We know that newborns prefer their mother's face, but can they recognize other faces? Right? So if they can recognize other faces, that not only requires visual perception, but it also requires memory. In the text, they talk about a number of studies where 1 to 3 day old infants, they'll stare longer at familiar faces regardless of the expression. So they had a familiar face, and one showed a happy expression, and one showed a sad expression, and they were able to recognize the face regardless of the emotion that it was presenting, which basically shows that infants have a functioning memory working. Other types of learning, infants are capable of learning classical conditioning, where one example was when they were pairing the touching across the infant's forehead with the presentation of the UCS, which was of the milk, and those were paired and learning occurred. Operant conditioning, an example of that where infants they learned that if they were to do something, they would get to hear their mother's voice. So they learned to suck in a particular pattern, and they were rewarded with that by hearing their mother's voice. Infants also learn through imitation, so they imitate facial expressions. You can see examples of that in figure 12.8. They'll do exactly what the adult is doing and mimic back and forth. So why is this important? Basically, infants, they're born with mechanisms that help them to respond to caretakers and important events in their environment. They're born with these mechanisms and these capabilities and these learnings already in them and active to ensure survival. Section 2, sensory perceptual development. The two areas of sensory perceptual development we're going to discuss are visual and auditory. So infant's visual field expands to almost adult size by 6 months. As we discussed, acuity improves. It improves in a continuous development function from 20/800 to 20/100 by 6 months, and then slower until it reaches adult acuity by the age of 4. So what you can see here in figure 12.9, the blue is the normal development of visual acuity, right? Starting at the age months after birth, 0, increases from 20/800, 2100, then by the age of 4, it's peaking closer to the adult at 2020. So what this graph is showing is that there's a critical sensitive period for damage to the visual acuity. Okay, but then it can, if it's repaired in time, it can catch up. So the red line shows an infant born with cataracts. So the infant had the cataracts from 0 to 6 months, where the cataracts were repaired, and since it was repaired within this critical sensitive time, the infant, the acuity rapidly improved to almost normal levels. Infant perception is organized around gestalt principles, closure and proximity, and depth perception by 3.5 months. While visual development has a continuous, gradual development, auditory senses do not necessarily. Sound localization has a U-shaped function, right? So it disappears at the age of 4 months and then reappears at the age of 6 months. So what this means is that Infants up until the age of 2 months are very attentive to sound, and they will turn their head very quickly to localize where a sound is coming from. This seems to disappear at 4 months, perhaps while they're paying attention to other things, but they don't have the same sound localization for a few months there. It seems to disappear, and then it comes back at the age of 6 months. So that's why it's got the U-shaped function. Phenome discrimination. This is auditory pattern perception. It's very advanced in young infants. Infants can detect the tiniest of little changes in sounds, called phenomes, by 1 or 2 months. They can turn their head very, very quickly to receive visual rewards. They can detect these changes in phenomes not only in their own language, but they can detect these changes in other languages as well. This ability they lose by the age of 12 months when they start talking in their own native language. And lastly, music perception. Infants, they appear to perceive music as adults do. They show similar responses of consonant and dissonant patterns as adults. They have the ability to process rhythm, pitch, melody, and they can remember music. In a study, one study that they talked about was infants that were played a certain type of music while they were in the womb, and then the control group that were not. And the infants, then after they were born, they were played the music again, and those that were played with the music in the womb reacted stronger in a way that sort of inferred that they remembered the music. They attended longer and more intensely to the music. The last section is physical, brain, and motor development. A few terms here for you to know. Maturation, it is a biologically programmed process that governs our growth. It's in our genes. It's the genetically pre-programmed biological process of how we're going to develop, like our map, right? The cephalocaudal principle is that development tends to proceed from head to foot. So as you can see there, a baby's head is quite large compared to the rest of the body, and that's because that is where the physical growth concentrates on the head first. And then secondly, the proximal-distal principle, which states that development comes from the innermost part of the body to the outermost. So therefore, your arms develop before your fingers. At birth, infants, they can control their shoulders and they can control their hips and such, but not their arm or hand muscles quite yet. So cephalocaudal principle is head to foot, top to bottom, whereas proximal-distal is from the inside to the outside development. For sections about the brain, at birth, infant brain is 25% of the adult brain weight, but by 6 months, it's 50% of the brain weight. During that time and continuing on, cells become larger and neural networks form. The stages, the first areas to develop is the brain stem, which regulates basic survival functions. That's supposed to say breathing, not breaking. Breathing and heartbeat. And then the last areas are associative areas of the frontal cortex, which have to do with the higher cognitive functions. Growth rate, by 5 years, the brain is 90% of the adult size. Rapid brain growth slows later in childhood. Goes up to 90% of the size, slows down. But it does continue to mature. Continued maturation, continued new synapses, cerebral hemispheres become more specialized. Motor development. So most skills follow a regular stage-like sequence. So all infants are going to follow the same sequence of steps, but at the age at which they acquire them could be different, right? So for example, chest up, use arms for support, this position here. It will happen on average, between the age of 2 months and 4 months. This far left represents like 25% of infants will have acquired it by that time, by 2 months, which is a little earlier. Whereas on the far right, by 4 months, that's 90%. So between 25 and 90%. So sitting up without support starts to develop just before 5 months. And then by just before 8 months, 90% of infants can master this, and so forth. And I've just left this slide here because it's a little bit bigger and possibly easier for you to see. And the last section here, environmental and cultural influences. So motor and physical development are guided by the genetic programs that we talked about, maturation, but experience plays a major role as well. And we talk about 3 different types of experience. There's physical, sensory, and motor development. Physical experience includes diet. Breastfeeding has been linked with improved cognitive development. Infants have been shown to thrive in enriched environments. Heavier brains, more synaptic connections. It's also been shown that physical touch, massages accelerates weight gain and neurological development, and which enhances learning. Sensory, visual deprivation can permanently damage visual abilities. As we talked about, the sensitive and critical period can be up to 10 years. Motor development. Motor development interacts powerfully with the child's environment. So as they learn to climb trees, as they learn to ride bikes, they're learning new skills. And the learning of these motor skills gives the opportunity to learn new skills. Experience plays a major role in development of sensory, perceptual, motor, and physical development. The general principles laid out are that biology sets limits on the environmental influences, right? So you've got an upper and a lower limit set out by biology of what you can achieve. Environmental influences can be very powerful. For example, a nurturing environment versus an impoverished environment have very big impacts on the development of infants. And biological and environmental factors interact. For example, an enriched environment enhances brain development, and then this enhanced brain development equals increased interaction with and learning in the environment, which results again in enhanced brain development. So there's cyclical interaction there. Okay, so in this section, part 2A, we talked about the amazing newborn, we talked about sensory perceptual development, and we talked about physical, brain, and motor development. In the next video, I'm going to look at cognitive development and social, emotional, and personality development. I'm going to keep the slides together just to make it easier. So until the next video, we have a little intermission. I'll see you in part B.